Okay, so we're going to move on to our next presentation, which will actually be a change from what you see in the program booklet. Dr. Tiffany Ng was going to talk about the amazing work she's been doing in diversifying the repertoire for the carillon. She's premiered over 60 works for the carillon and undertaken several projects to increase the diversity of composers writing for carillon. Her programming is always thoughtful with a strong social justice component, and she's worked really hard to incorporate that into all of her teaching so that her students become real ambassadors for the carillon and for this kind of sensitive approach to making cultural connections through their music making. So we should hear more about that work at some point, but we've decided to do something which historical keyboardists do very well, which is to improvise this morning. So yesterday we heard Chee performing a number of his works that were inspired by traditional Navajo chants. We also heard the premiere of his new composition, Sand Paintings for Piano, and the premiere of a new carillon piece. That was a very good day. So what we've decided to do this morning is to have a conversation led by Tiffany Ng and Chee talking about composing for the carillon. And we just also wanted to announce that the live stream of that premiere from last night has been rescheduled for 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning. So that's our live stream audiences might want to check that out in a couple of hours. Anyway, welcome, and we look very forward to this conversation.
All right. Oh. Can we get the mic on here? Directly. Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Kola, and thank you for also Kimberly and Alex for this momentous and incredibly important encyclopedia project. There is so much information in it, but also there's going to be so much inspiration in it. So this is epic, and I'm so heartened. I know this has been a long conference, and so I encourage anyone who needs to step out and take care of their well-being to do so, especially because one of the content topics of our talk today is going to be trauma. And so please just step out and take care of yourself anytime. Come back in anytime as well. So it's my pleasure and honor to get to welcome Chee back to the stage here. And thank you so much, Connor, for accepting my invitation late last night over text message to have an impromptu conversation with me about being a Native American composer writing for carillon and what it means also to your Indigenous listeners. I come to this conversation with you with the understanding that I'm asking you only to speak for yourself rather than to speak for the entire group of Native Americans, as has oftentimes been a duty that has been placed on you. So I wanted to have this conversation because last night's premiere of your incredible piece, Melody for Kia'ani, numbers 1 and 2, was a bigger moment than just the incredibly gorgeous music and the fact that you're the first commissioned Native American composer to develop solo carillon pieces and to publish them. So I just want to make 2 points to give some greater context to that moment. First, earlier generations of ethnomusicologists built some of their careers on collecting native music by either transcribing it into Euro-Western notation and publishing that, or by making field recordings and publishing those. And that's, of course, a questionable practice that I'll cede to you to talk about or give your thoughts on. I say this because a few such transcriptions did get arranged for Carillon without consideration for those ethical issues. And so the earliest instance that I know of is the Dutch Carillonist Leonard Hart's 1976 arrangement called Indian Medicine Song, Yoke. There's no tribal attribution, no information about it. It's also medicine, which makes me doubtful that it's okay to play on a classical instrument. So I wanted to ask for your personal thoughts about this history and any advice you would have to us as Carillonists about what to do with that kind of music that's in circulation. And I don't know if maybe other, members of your Navajo tribe, for example, would have different opinions.
I think it's interesting because a lot of these things from the past where they've taken things from different tribes and used it in composition sort of contributed to that pan-Indian identity, that it's Native American and it can sort of speak for all of Native America when there are so many tribes. I think there's like 574 federally recognized tribes, and all with different customs and different cultures, and sort of the mishmash that I've seen in some of this music, taking from so many different places. And it doesn't, I think, translate well, at least from an indigenous perspective. And what I really appreciate about this conference is bringing light to the fact that there is music available from indigenous composers and from other marginalized composers. And I think that is really the best source of sharing that type of music. And like you said, there is a lot of music that is sacred that shouldn't be shared, that shouldn't be performed certain times of the year or in certain spaces. And that's information that you can get from the tribal members. And these composers will have that knowledge of what is appropriate to share and when and how. And that really takes a lot of the mystery away for performers who might not be accustomed to the culture or the practices. So
that's such great advice. And is that something where it's a service that we should also make sure to offer compensation for?
Yeah,
if we can.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of resources, and I think something I mentioned the other day in the other panel discussion that I'm seeing a lot is institutions that have problems with diversity and going to marginalized people and expecting them to fix the problems that they created, and often for free. I'm seeing a lot of my peers who are being asked from organizations to come and just have a chat and have a conversation where, a lot of other problems, you go to a consultant, you pay a consulting fee, and you really attack this from a different way. And it's interesting to me to see, these issues where it's great that they're recognizing it now and sort of just not approaching it in a way that I think is appropriate, and not necessarily on purpose, but just not having that second thought of what is the correct way to approach it, which I appreciate, to just then go to these people where the culture that was stolen from, and then say, okay, now you fix what we've done, for free. It's kind of just expected, and it creates a whole new level of problems in the mix of a very complex issue.
Yeah, we can't have decolonization if we're also still doing an extractive institutional model in relation to those marginalized peoples. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I was so hesitant last night to text you and even ask you to be part of this conversation because it wasn't something that I had planned to, include as part of your responsibilities or what you were paid to present this at this conference. So your generosity means a lot, and to all of us.
Well, I'm happy to do it.
And you know, that term decolonization, I only last year actually encountered Tuck and Yang's paper from 2012 called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And their argument is that decolonization is literal repatriation of land from settler colonialists, which includes me, which includes people of color, anyone who's non-indigenous. And their argument also goes further to say that any metaphorical use of that term, like decolonizing the canon, for example, is actually a dangerous dilution of that urgency to return land. And maybe it becomes a temptation for keyboardists to enjoy the idea that we are decolonizing without actually giving up stolen lands that we do that work on. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, another very complex issue, and that has like a very clear underpinning. And, you know, what I see a lot from indigenous musicians and artists all over is, you know, with the land back movement, you know, if you're not going to give the land back, well, then give us some resources. You know, there are so many creative and talented, hardworking tribal members who want to do so much. And not only was the land stolen, but all of the resources, and, you know, on the reservation, that there's still a lot of places with no electricity and no running water, you know, no internet connection. And how are we to expect, you know, someone to come out of that and when they're just trying to survive and make change in all of these institutions? You know, I think there's sort of a disconnect there as well, and that this land back movement it really is kind of addressing those issues. You know, that it's a lot of the resources that are available for people to do what they want to do or what needs to be done.
Thank you so much. That's such a great point. My second piece of context here is that in recent years, things have gotten a little better with the Carillon world. Doris Amon at the University of Rochester, for example, and Andrea McCready at Peace Tower in Ottawa blazed a path forward by collaborating with Indigenous women in upstate New York and Canada. So Haudenosaunee musician Joanne Shenandoah, who was a Grammy Award-winning musician and took home many Native American music awards as well, and is from Syracuse, she worked with Doris to develop a Native American Carillon medley and also sang with the Carillon. Unfortunately, her residency at Rochester was cut short by the pandemic, and tragically, she actually passed away in November, and so we'll never get to hear the final products of that amazing collaboration. At the Canadian Parliament buildings, Andrea McCready has premiered composer-authorized arrangements of We Are Circling by Buffy Sainte-Marie, which just blows my mind, Pacific Dogwood by pianist-organist Beverly McIver, whose mother was from Laxal First Nation, and Nunavut, Our Home by Inuit throat singer and journalist Madeline Alakarialak. I wrote these comments at 3 a.m., so forgive me that I haven't learned to say all the names yet. So in recent years, there has been a growing movement amongst actually women, apparently, to find some new approaches to inviting Indigenous collaboration with the Carillon. So that's our context, as far as I know, for Connor being the very first Native American composer to write this solo Carillon work, to publish it in notated format. But last night, the YouTube premiere of Music for Kia'ani, number 1 and 2, didn't happen online as scheduled. And I got home to puzzled messages asking, you know, like, we're still waiting for the video, what happened? So thank you to all of you out on YouTube who were waiting and are waiting still. You now have the time for the premiere when we'll roll that video. But Connor, just actually, because of some last-minute changes, was in the Belfry with me. And what you were doing actually changed my whole framework for understanding our premieres. So I was wondering if you would just tell us about what was happening.
Well, I mean, my live stream, I know that there's a YouTube live stream, but I was live streaming on TikTok as well. It was really interesting, you know, the different ways that audiences connect. And there was a lot of really great feedback from those that were listening and discovering the instrument for the first time, and also some interesting comments.
And you told me last night that most of your followers are Native?
I would say, I don't know that most, but there's, I think, definitely a large percentage of them are Indigenous. But some of the comments that really kind of struck me were that there was a lot of trauma associated with bells for Indigenous people, and that it was, for a lot of them, I think, healing to hear something coming from a different place and taking up this sound space that originally for them really triggered a lot of emotions, really negative emotions. And it kind of got me thinking about the different ways that we're approaching all of these problems, because on the one hand, we want to, get rid of and dismantle a lot of these things that are traumatic, and that is coming from a place that I think is very valid and that needs to be listened to. And, the approach that I'm taking is different. I'm not saying it's the right approach or a better one, just a different one, of sort of making space in these places where, historically there was no space for people like myself or other marginalized groups, and sort of a reclamation of that space. And different people respond differently and have different ideas, but I think that there are a lot of things that we need to consider. And I think it's really amazing, all of the work that Tiffany's doing in just with the carillon, which is an amazing thing because it is such a public, like a democratic instrument where everybody can hear it. It's not something that you have to worry about, can I afford to go down to the symphony hall? Can I afford to pay for a ticket to go and listen to this recital? That is in a way very excludes a lot of people. That just, it's not a reality. And it's an interesting thing connecting the carillon and also this live streaming where we can reach thousands, hundreds, thousands, millions of people that don't have to purchase a ticket. They have to have internet access still. There's these problems that still exist, but it's on a different level of, like I said, people just can't afford to go and experience a lot of these things, so.
And your TikTok has had 1,000 or more interactions with your carillon videos from this conference, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in it.
That's incredible. You have such a following, and I feel like it's such a privilege to get to be a part of that and to tap into that for this weekend. Tell us more about the title of your piece, actually.
I was thinking about in the Navajo culture, your clans, you have 4 clans: your mother's, your father's, your mother's father, and your father's father. And my second clan is Kiani, which is the Towering House clan. And I just thought of that was an interesting correlation between my clan, the Towering House people, and the instrument, which I really got to know a lot, through the compositional process. And that sort of inspired what I was doing with the instrument and the sounds that I was creating. And that's sort of where I turned for my inspiration when composing these.
You said that when I first sight read through some of your piano pieces, the ones that I could adapt to carillon, that you would take that to your grandfather. Is he? Was it that grandfather?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
I hope to do that too. I mean, I haven't seen him in a while, and just because of the pandemic, it really hit the Navajo Nation hard. But he's always excited to see how his music is connecting with the world as well. It's a little bit mind-boggling, I think, sometimes to really, it makes me sit back and think how amazing it is to connect with so many people, where not that long ago, it really wasn't a possibility of what we're doing today. And because we're always on our phones and we're kind of just connected to this grid, we sometimes really take it for granted, the reach and the resources we have. It really puts it in perspective.
It was such an amazing experience to see your videos of your grandfather in your talk and to recognize some of the musical motifs there. I felt so connected to him, so it's amazing. So just to give I'm trained as a musicologist, so I'll do my musicology thing for a second. This association of bells and traumas is it's documented. For example, Patrick Nicholson, a musicologist who actually wrote this paper to deliver here at the University of Michigan back in 2017, wrote about the message of the carillon, bells as instruments of colonialism in 20th century Canada, where he unpacked the role of bells bells as oppressive regulatory systems in the residential schools to which Indigenous children were separated from their families and taken in order to just destroy their culture. He has some quotations actually from the oral histories that were done with survivors. I'll just read this aloud for a bit. These institutional developments at the residential schools occurred under a system within which student survivors testified that they were, quote, living by bells, unquote. Beverly Diamond and Dylan Robinson have both turned their attention to bells as one element in a larger sonic regime of colonial order within the schools. Indeed, survivor testimonies, even just in the official publications of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, frequently reveal the traumatic impact of what Diamond calls the, quote, rigid organization of time that contrasted markedly with the context-sensitive way of life that Aboriginal children had come from, unquote. There seemed to be bells everywhere, one student testified. There was the morning bell at 7, then there was a bell for breakfast, one for classes at 9, and others too. Another student, reflecting on their time in the system, writes, all around the schoolyard there were fences beyond which we didn't set foot. Bells were ringing all day long. And so we have fences and bells here in the same category for the experience of that student survivor. And thank goodness for local journalism. Today, very recently, Santa Cruz removed the second of the only El Camino Real mission bells on city-owned land. And the, I can't see my notes here, so let me check that I am. Okay, here. The Ama Mutsun tribal band has been advocating for years for the removal of these mission bells, which are markers posted along California highways and in communities connecting the 21 Franciscan missions from Los Angeles to Sonoma. This marker system is a romanticization of this missionary project, which was so decimating to Indigenous people in California. And so here we have a photograph of Louise J. Miranda Ramirez, tribal chairwoman of the Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation, speaking about the hurtful connotation those mission bells evoke for California's Indigenous peoples and calling for a reform of elementary school curriculum. And this is the screenshot that I sent you last night, Connor. We actually have some quotations in this article from people who attended, Native people who attended this event of the removal of that final bell in Santa Cruz. So at the top, these missions represent the institutionalization, the enslavement, the incarceration of our Native peoples, said Morningstar Gali, a member of the Ajumawi band of the Pitt River Tribe and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And if you look down to the second arrow, this comes from Mary Lopez Kiefer, a member of the San Luis Rey Lucieno Band of Mission Indians and director of the Office of Native American Affairs. The mission bells are a very emotional topic for myself and my family members, Lopez Kiefer said, breaking into tears. Whenever I hear them ring, I have an overwhelming feeling of anxiety. That's historical trauma. And so, you know, in this context, Cotter, and I'm sorry, this is hard to talk about. I hope I'm not putting too much on you. Like, what have we done last night, and what does it mean?
I think it's a little bit what I said earlier about sort of a reclamation, you know, of that sound space and addressing issues that really aren't addressed or haven't been addressed. And I think also for these survivors of these traumatic experiences, there's a lot of trauma that in a lot of these places hasn't been addressed internally for them, and resources haven't been made available for that. And it presents itself in so many different ways and creates a lot of problems in the tribal settings. You know, I have seen recently a lot of the dying Navajo language, for example. You know, my father didn't teach me to speak Navajo, like, purposefully, because he thought it was gonna hold me back. And that was the case with a lot of my generation, of not being able to speak the language at a young age. And there were a lot of my generation being mad at my parents' generation for that. And then my parents' generation saying, well, it's your responsibility to learn the language. And this infighting really, you have to take a step back, and where did this come from? This came from the cultural genocide. This really isn't our fault or their fault. This was something that came from the residential schools and the way that this was treated. And it's just, not addressed. And so, like I said, the work that you're doing with the Carillon and reclaiming these spaces, I think is starting to really have people reflect upon things that they didn't internalize and just really not thought about. And music specifically is so internalized, and it lasts in our memory and in our heart in a way that, is so incredibly surprising that it can reach inside. And I think that's an experience a lot of people have with music, is that it can also address these issues that are traumatic. It can bring up things, these historical traumas that you might not even think about, the rippling effects that they've had. And there's, so many layers to this issue, but it's important.
Thank you. It seems like, on the one hand, the removal of those bells, those mission bells, which are not carillon bells, not part of an instrument that you can play, is one way of healing. And then another way of healing is actually to have artists like you take over these instruments and create extraordinary new music on them. So, we're finding all these ways forward. And when you say, my work, this is totally our work together. Thank you. So I know that we're coming up on the end of our time, and I know also that this is kind of the last big, I think, concluding the conference in terms of speaking sort of stuff. So I want to take a moment to make some general comments here about trauma and my experience with Westfield. So I have to tell you why Westfield has been more important to me than possibly any of you know, in order to kind of bring this all back together. I attended my first Westfield meeting in 2009. It was a collaboration with Eroy when I was a master's student of Bill Porter. I was overawed by Annette Richards and the whole leadership, but I mean, who isn't overawed by Annette Richards? Hello. And in 2012, Matthew Durst and Robert Bates organized a Westfield meeting in Houston that I still warmly remember to this day. It's where I first heard Pamela perform, where I got to take home a Best Student Paper Award that made me feel like a real, actual historical keyboards studies person, and where Kimberly Marshall first approached me to tell me that she was going to support my career. And boy, have you, so thank you so much. I owe you forever. And there were more fantastic meetings. And when Pamela nominated me to the Board of Trustees, I couldn't believe that I could not now help bring these experiences to other people. And nobody loves Zoom, but I have to say that our board meetings have been amongst my favorite Zoom events of the entire pandemic, because you're just such amazing colleagues. Joining the board also brought me back from the brink of deciding not to attend any more Westfield events in the near future. Not because of people who are wonderful, but because of the risk of having to live afterwards with some upsetting thoughts. At one meeting, a speaker exhorted listeners to travel to post-colonial lands, play the historical organs there, and really be present for the sensory pleasure of the experience. And as a child of immigrants from a former British territory, the Hong Kong, it's creepy to be included in this encouragement to seek sensorial pleasure in exotic lands. It's disturbing to encounter the blithe disregard of these instruments as tools of violent colonial projects. And it was traumatizing to hear nobody push back against this idea in the Q&A, and not to be able to push back myself, because time was just too short for me to formulate a response. So yesterday, Leon boldly opened his talk with the devastation brought upon the Inuit peoples of Labrador and Newfoundland by colonization and its attendant church organs as part of that project. He called out the tendency in historical keyboard studies to assume that instruments and their music are basically good things that require no defense. So if keyboards are neither inherently good or bad, right, then we must intentionally make them do good things. And Connor, you're such a brilliant artist and icon that you've brought an entirely new life and meaning to the Carillon. And Leon's takedown of that comment yesterday, that comment I heard at Westfield years ago, was a healing moment for me. And between his keynote and each and every one of you gathered for this conference, I really feel like I fully belong in Westfield, to just go back to the title of the theme of our conference. So, thank you.